Hypericum calicinum. This is St. John's worts. We got this in this little pot because it's been difficult to keep alive. So any type of hypericums around here, I've found them to be challenging. So you can get it to go, but you got to really put it in a spot that you can watch it. You can't just set it out there and wish it well and hope it does well. When it is healthy, it is a gorgeous plant. It's got these great yellow flowers. It's got this interesting leaf arrangement. A little hard to see in this one, but they're opposite leaf arrangement, and they almost seem to be somewhat symmetrical in the way. You get two leaves going in one direction, and then they get oriented in the other, and they're fairly close together. Other than that, yeah, the leaves themselves aren't particularly standoutish. It's really just how those opposite leaves are arranged on the stem. Ilex decidua, common name is possum haw. Now, Ilex is the genus of hollies. Now, most of your hollies are going to be evergreen. In fact, there's a holly right behind it that's evergreen, but this particular one's deciduous. It's getting crowded out, so our specimen's not the greatest. It's a native, so it's not particularly remarkable. Identifying this thing shouldn't be too difficult on our quiz. The easiest part you're going to see is berries. So these are holly berries. They will end up ripening up and becoming red, but they're just starting now. The other thing is, we haven't seen this yet, but the arrangement's close to whorled, meaning that we've got all the leaves emerging in a very tight cluster there. Now what you'll see is the leaves are on these really short stems referred to as spurs. These are really tightly condensed buds that are developing. So you'll see that along the stem quite a bit. So between the whorled arrangement, the berries, and those spurs, this unremarkable leaf really isn't going to be necessary for identification. Ilex latifolia, this is luster leaf holly. Now don't judge this plant by this sad looking specimen. It's the only one we have on campus. I think it's just getting too much shade on that side, and it's a tough place to grow. Compact, gets dry, a lot of competition from the surrounding trees. At one time it was really a handsome shrub. It just has these glossy leaves, almost reminds me a little bit of magnolia, but you can see that distinctive serration that's on the margins there. And it does have this kind of pale green stem on the newer growth that as you get a little bit older starts to turn grayish to brown. Nothing more distinct than that. I mean, as far as hollies go, this one has probably one of the largest and glossiest leaves, but there's some other ones out there that I've seen that have done quite well that can serve this purpose. I'd really like to try this in other places just because of what I've seen previously. Now, because this is a holly, if it is healthy, what you're going to see is it does have some berries on it. But this one's in just such poor shape, it's just not going to produce much. Alyssium anisatum. This is star anise. Now, I'm not 100% convinced on this one, but it's been previously labeled as anisatum. And the one thing that keeps me a little bit reluctant of diving in is the tips aren't quite as pointed or as I would often see. But there's a couple things that kind of keep me leaning towards it. I know parviflorum will have upright leaves, but this one quickly starts to come out from the stem more straight out, like you see with some of these right here. The one thing though that keeps me leaning towards this could be correct. Well, we know it's not Floridanum because it doesn't have any red petioles anywhere, so we can cross that off. So now it's between that and parviflorum. Anisatum is said to have a wavering margin, and you can see that in a couple. Look how that just kind of waves a little bit. It's not on every single one of them. It's just here and there you can see the margin kind of wavering a little bit. So with a lack of prominent leaves pointing up, there is no red petiole, some of the wavering on the foliage. This one does have enough that we can stick with this one being the Alyssium anisatum. Alyssium floridanum, this is Florida anise. Now, of the Alyssiums that we'll cover, this one's by and far the most common. Now, I'm surprised it's flowering. It really, you do any research, it's going to show you that it's flowering in April, May, somewhere around then there, but looks like we're getting another sporadic bloom here now, which is going to be helpful for identifying this guy. Now, if we get a chance to see the other Alyssiums, there's a couple things about this one to identify. One is it's got red petioles. Now that does vary. If we look down into some of these others, where there's some probably has to do with maturity or its exposure to light. Remember, light really has a lot to do with color development, is one of them. The other one is the others just don't flower with this color right here. So this red's or fuchsia's gonna be really the easy thing for us. The other thing with the Alyssiums in general is a lot of sources will say that the floridanum, if you crush it and smell it, it's gonna smell like licorice, or some people describe it as a gin and tonic, either one, but it's unique in that respect. Now, what I always notice is that any of the species, they all smell like licorice. So I don't really find that as being something that separates the species, but does help me in terms of identifying Alyssium itself. The leaf itself is smooth to the touch, almost glossy, and you do have that prominent midrib there. That's a much lighter color. Alyssium parviflorum, this is yellow anise. Now this is similar in a lot of ways to the floridanum, which tends to be a lot more common. Two things that are different. One is the flowers come out, they're yellow, whereas the floridanum is going to be that red burgundy color. The other thing about this one is the leaves tend to orient themselves very upright. And you can see that in this younger specimen right here, where the leaves almost point straight up in a lot of cases. Now it all depends on the specimen. There's some ones over here that have been sheared more into these circles, and we get a little bit of that growth habit expressed there, but not quite to the degree this is. Now you can crush a leaf, it's going to smell like licorice or gin and tonic, whatever you want to classify that. So it's hard to tell the difference between the two species. In this case, it's primarily the leaf orientation, and if you're around when it's flowering, you're going to get that difference as well. Itea virginica, or sweet shrub, also referred to as Virginia sweet shrub. Now, unfortunately, we just planted this one, so some of the characteristics that we would normally see aren't here. That is some of the spent flower stalks. This is the dwarf variety, so it'll get about 3 feet tall, and they can get a little bit bigger. The nice thing about this native is it's very informal, so you want to plant this in areas where it can kind of blend in, so it doesn't have anything outstanding. The flowers in the spring are fantastic. Pollinators love them. Identifying this thing is going to really come down to just paying attention to the green stem, and then if you look closely at the margins, you're going to see it just has a very fine serration. The leaves themselves aren't particularly remarkable. Lonicera fragmentissima. This is winter honeysuckle, or sometimes called fragrant honeysuckle. This one's on the emerging threat list. Now around here I haven't noticed it being where it gets out. I've been up in zone 5 and it was everywhere, so it is a problem in some parts, but much cooler. Multi-stem, really cool trunk on it. As far as the exfoliating bark, not used much down there. It is incredibly fragrant in the spring. As far as identifying this, it's more or less the unremarkable aspects are going to set it off. Opposite leaf arrangement, smooth margin, smooth leaf, fairly round. The new stem itself is going to be closer to tan. Older growth turns gray, but that's about it. Tan stem, fairly ordinary leaf in opposite leaf arrangement. Older stems get gray. So as far as identifying it, just from a sample, that's That's what you'll be looking for. Nerium oleander, commonly known as oleander. This thing's gotten too big and I'm holding off on pruning until we cover it, at which point it's multi-stemmed and we'll just end up probably removing most of that or doing like a renewal prune, taking it to the ground. This is highly valued for a couple of reasons. One, it's tough, very salt tolerant. You see this downtown. When it goes into full flower, you get all sorts of colors depending on the cultivar. This one just has a couple sporadic ones. Identifying this, well, this is well known for its toxicity, so no recommendations on tasting this whatsoever. Identifying this, yeah, you can see it's a very long, narrow leaf, very prominent midrib there. If you turn it over, you can see it protrudes from the backside. If you look a little bit closer, look at the veins, very symmetrically arranged, coming off almost perpendicular from that midrib. Very bright green stem until you get back to some of the older growth, and then you start to get more of that gray corkiness to it with this opposite leaf arrangement. Philadelphus coronarius. This is sweet mock orange. Now this is what some people refer to as an old-fashioned plant. You don't see this around very much. I just don't see it around the low country much. It's supposed to have some fragrance to the flowers. This one's surviving in some pretty tough conditions, but usually it'll get bigger, much bigger once it's in a happier spot. Identifying this thing should be fairly easy on this list here. Really distinctly opposite leaf arrangement with that almost a very pale petiole there, and look how red that stem is. And what's interesting is if you follow that back as that stem starts to mature, you start to see it peel a little bit and you get more of a striated look to the older stems. And I find this thing makes that fairly easy to identify. Another one is a lot of the leaf margins are undulating on this one here. So there's enough characteristics on this that does make it a little easier to identify from other ones. How much you're going to see it out in the landscape is not going to be much. Like I said, it's considered more of an old-fashioned plant that just not used as much these days. Poncirus trifoliata. This is the hardy orange. This is technically the flying dragon cultivar. It is on the invasive list, and it's a really cool specimen. And you get these orange fruits that I think are edible, but they're not super tasty, and they're loaded with seeds, and those seeds will spread fairly easy. Identifying this thing is going to be not difficult at all, because this particular one, and again, the flying dragon's contorted, but look at that thorn coming off, no problem. Looking at that dark green stem that's going to be throughout this until you get to some of the more mature stems. It is the species being trifoliata. It is a trifoliate leaflet, or trifoliate leaf with 3 leaflets. Really, with these characteristics, there's not much else you need to identify this. Again, really kind of a cool specimen in terms of just the standalone feature. Punica granatum. This is pomegranate. Now, for this particular sample here, it's been trapped under some shade, and after we do some pruning at some point, we'll get some more sunlight in here, and at that point we might get fruit production, because this particular shrub really isn't for anything ornamental. It's fairly ordinary multi-stem shrub. Its biggest value is going to be in the fruit production. So if you've ever had a pomegranate, it's about the size of an apple. We did have, looks like one flower, but it just didn't pollinate. So we really don't see any fruit off this one. It is at times opposite leaf arrangement, and take a look at the margin there. You'll see it undulates just slightly. So you'll see how the leaves are opposite arranged. In fact, the one right behind my finger is what's called sub-opposite, meaning it's close to opposite, but just slightly offset. But if you continue looking down the stem, what you'll find is you get a lot of whorled arrangements. So in those from those axillary buds, you'll get a handful of leaves, in this case simple leaves, emerging. So you do have some that are just opposite to sub-opposite, and then you get some stems that are going to be whorled, and paying attention to that undulating margin. Viburnum prunifolium. This is Black Haw viburnum. This is probably the only one that at least I've recognized in the low country. Doesn't mean they're not out there. It's just it's so ordinary in terms of its leaves. This thing's growing in some really tough conditions. A lot of shade, compacted ground, a lot of competition from surrounding trees. So when I say it's ordinary, I mean there's not a whole lot of defining characteristics here as far as a leaf. It looks just like, think of just an ordinary leaf. Fine serration on the margins there, and you do see it tends to almost be whorled there at the tip in terms of its arrangement. One thing for identification purposes is this time of the year we'll find some fruit in there. So you see what looks like a little immature berry that we'll be able to just at least be able to use in our identification class. One thing you'll also notice, see those tips dying back? That's actually a twig borer that gets on a lot of different things. This thing's hung into an area that's pretty tough, but it's starting to give way a little bit. It'd be worth trying, but I'm not sure this is really a standout type plant. But it is native, so that could sway your decision if you're looking at something, especially it's going to be a little bit more informal or a naturalized area. Viburnum wrightii. This is right viburnum. Strikes me more as a viburnum just because of the arrangement of the veins being a little bit more symmetrical in that herringbone layout. This particular one definitely has a pubescence on it, so it's rough to touch. So the leaf shape itself is somewhat unique. I like the scalloped margins on this one. That helps as well. This one just happens to be putting out some flowers, but it's not the time of the year. I think it's more stressed out. What we normally see with viburnums is that panicum, that panicle of small flowers, and this one is starting to have some mature fruit on it. So you see them all on those stalks together, starting to turn colors. They do attract wildlife, which is a plus. Other than that, this one is surviving in a pretty tough area right here. Easy to identify with some of the features, including those berries right there. As far as using it in the landscape, again, this is not something that's super common. Probably be more of a naturalizing one, but with even in this tough shaded area, there's quite a few berries that are coming out on this thing. So this would be a good choice if somebody's wanting to make a selection that's going to attract wildlife. Weigela Florida. Florida Weigela, that's the common name. Some people say Weigelia or Weigela. This multi-stem shrub gets, it stays in around 3-4 feet. At times struggles around here, so it's not bulletproof. It does get a lot of flowers up and down the stems in the springtime. Identifying it now, there's a couple things to look for. What I always notice is you start to look at that opposite leaf arrangement and look at that reddish color on the stem. That's the newer stem. Of course, it turns gray on the older growth here. The other thing I'll notice on this before we get to the leaves is you notice it's got some prominent, very noticeable lenticels along the stems. So those kind of whitish long marks are used for gas exchange along the stem. As far as the leaves go, very distinctly opposite in leaf arrangement, and they tend to stay all oriented in the same direction, so they don't go in one direction and then the next set of leaves orients in the other direction like we see with some opposite leaf arrangement. The other thing that I always seem to notice is not just how acuminate that apex is. You see how it comes to a tip there. Look at the margins, how wavy those things are, and you'll notice that on quite a few of them. So the wavy margins, the long tip that does have a slight serration, and that reddish stem with some lenticels. You can use that to identify that Cyrilla racemiflora. This is the swamp TT. Another common name is American Cyrilla, but TT is just more fun to say. I don't see this used very often. It is a native, likes it moist, even grows in swampy areas. It's got a nice texture, almost looks a little bit like wax myrtles, but it flowers middle of the summer, and right now what we're seeing are the seeds developing, these capsules. So these flowers form these little white flowers on these pendulous spikes here, and so the fruit itself is going to hang on through the winter. So you do get a nice ornamental appeal out of it. It's very regular in terms of its form, so it's good as a naturalizing plant. It's one of these I'd love to see more of, just being native, especially if you got a damp area. Full sun to part shade, but you can see this spends a little bit more than half of its time in the shade over here in this location, and it does really well. We've even beat it up pretty good just trying to prune it out of the road, and it responds to heading cuts just fine. For identifying, the seed pods are going to be really what you're going to be using here, but you can see the leaves aren't remarkable in terms of shape. You do get a distinctive color on that petiole right there, very bright, almost a bright yellowish, and it contrasts nicely with the leaves here. Yeah, nice plant. This is certainly one I'd move up my list. It might be hard to find, that's the only issue. Vaccinium mashii. This is the rabbit eye blueberry. Now this isn't the best specimen to use, but it's enough that we can get the characteristics down. Now this is the blueberry where we get blueberries. Edible. Some species, some cultivars are not quite as edible. They're good for wildlife. Birds really like them. They do have some ornamental appeal, where we see that exfoliating bark on the stems, and you get a nice symmetrical arrangement of the foliage. You get these green stems of the newer growth. You can see secondary growth. You get more of that beige tan look, but the newer stems are green. That's always a good thing to keep in mind when we look at a specimen for identification. Also, a lot of times I notice you get kind of a white, kind of glaucous color on the bottom side of the leaves. The leaf shape itself isn't particularly remarkable. For quizzing purposes, we do have a specimen here that's hanging on to some blueberries from earlier in the year. This is in the family of Ericaceae, so it does best if it's going to be in an acidic soil. Don't let it dry out. Likes it well drained and moist. How it survives in this wheelbarrow, we don't give it additional irrigation, so it seems to hang in there pretty good. So it's kind of a testament that it can be tough. This can be used as a nice ornamental, and even if you want to just grow it for feeding wildlife. Blueberries in general, they're dioecious, so they do best if you have a minimum of 2 different cultivars in the area for pollination. 3 or more is ideal. There are cultivars that are self-pollinating, but yeah, usually the words of wisdom are using multiple cultivars to maximize your harvest.